At exactly 11:47 p.m. every night, Clara Pemberton heard them. The sounds that made her blood run cold and her hands shake as she clutched her rosary. From room 401, 4 floors above where she now slept in the abandoned St. Jude's Hospital, came the unmistakable sounds of medical procedures. The grinding of bone saws, muffled screams, and the wet slapping of instruments against flesh. But St. Jude's had been officially closed for 3 months, and Clara was supposedly the only living soul within its walls. Before we dive into Clara's terrifying vigil in the halls of St. Jude's, I need to ask you a favor. If you're enjoying these dark stories from America's forgotten past, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We bring you the most chilling mysteries that others are afraid to tell. And I'm curious, from which city and country are you listening to this story? Leave a comment below and let us know. Your support helps us continue uncovering these buried secrets. Now, let me tell you about Clara Pemberton and the sounds that haunted room 401. According to the few surviving records and the whispered accounts passed down through Baltimore's medical community, what happened at St. Jude's Hospital during the winter of 1891 was something the city's authorities desperately wanted to forget. St. Jude's Hospital stood like a fortress of red brick and limestone on the eastern edge of Baltimore's Federal Hill District, overlooking the choppy waters of the Patapsco River. Built in 1867 to serve the city's growing population of Irish and German immigrants, the 4-story structure had earned a reputation as a place where the poor could receive medical care without the judgment that plagued them at the city's more prestigious institutions. The hospital's corridors smelled perpetually of carbolic acid and lye soap, a sharp contrast to the damp industrial air that drifted in from the nearby shipyards. Its windows, tall and narrow in the Gothic revival style, let in just enough light during the day to illuminate the worn wooden floors and plain white walls. At night, gas lamps cast dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. Clara Pemberton had served as head nurse at St. Jude's for 7 years before its closure in September 1891. At 32, she was considered a spinster by Baltimore society's standards, but her dedication to the hospital had always been absolute. She had trained under the strict supervision of Dr. Sebastian Morse, the hospital's chief surgeon, who had arrived from Philadelphia in 1885 with impeccable credentials and an innovative approach to surgery that had initially impressed the hospital's board of directors. Dr. Morse was a tall, gaunt man with prematurely grey hair and eyes the color of winter ice. He spoke with a slight European accent that he claimed came from his medical training in Vienna, though no one at St. Jude's had ever verified this claim. His surgical techniques were undeniably advanced for the time, and his success rate with complex procedures had earned him recognition throughout Maryland's medical community. The hospital's 4th floor housed the surgical ward, with room 401 serving as the primary operating theater. It was a spacious room with large windows facing north to provide consistent lighting, equipped with the latest surgical instruments and a marble-topped operating table that Dr. Morse had imported from Germany. The room's walls were lined with glass cabinets containing bottles of chloroform, ether, and various surgical tools that gleamed under the gaslight. Clara had always felt uncomfortable in room 401, though she couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was the way Dr. Morse insisted on conducting certain procedures alone, dismissing even her experienced assistants. Or maybe it was the unusual number of patients from the city's poorest districts who seemed to disappear after being admitted to the 4th floor for routine procedures. The beginning of the end came on a particularly cold November night in 1891. Clara was working the night shift when she heard sounds from room 401 that chilled her to the bone. It was well past midnight, and the hospital was supposed to be quiet except for the occasional moan from recovering patients. But from the 4th floor came the unmistakable sounds of a surgical procedure in progress. Clara climbed the stairs quietly, her oil lamp casting eerie shadows on the walls. As she approached room 401, she could hear Dr. Morse's voice, but he seemed to be speaking to multiple people. The strange thing was, No surgical procedures had been scheduled for that night, and Clara had seen Dr. Morse leave the hospital hours earlier. Through the keyhole, she glimpsed movement and the flash of surgical instruments under lamplight, but what she saw made no sense. Dr. Morse appeared to be operating on someone who was awake and moving, while two other figures in dark clothing held the patient down. The sounds she heard were not the controlled environment of proper surgery, but something far more disturbing. The next morning, Clara couldn't find any record of a nighttime surgery. When she asked Dr. Morse about it, his ice-cold eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her step backward. "Miss Pemberton," he said slowly, "I trust you understand the importance of discretion in medical matters. Some treatments require unconventional approaches." From that night forward, Clara noticed changes in the hospital's operations. Certain patients would be admitted through a back entrance after dark, brought in by men she didn't recognize. These patients never appeared on the official registry, and Clara never saw them leave. When she asked about them, Dr. Morse would simply tell her they had been transferred to other facilities. The strange nocturnal activities continued through the winter months. Clara began keeping her own informal records, noting the dates and times when she heard activity in room 401 after hours. The pattern was always the same: sounds of struggle, muffled cries, and the grinding of surgical instruments that seemed to go on for hours. By spring of 1891, word began to spread through Baltimore's medical community about unusual practices at St. Jude's Hospital. Dr. Marcus Whitfield, a respected physician from Johns Hopkins, had been asking questions about patients who had been referred to St. Jude's for routine procedures, but had never returned to their families. The investigation began quietly, with Dr. Whitfield and two colleagues conducting discreet inquiries among the families of missing patients. What they discovered was a pattern of poor immigrants and transients being admitted to St. Jude's for minor ailments, only to vanish without explanation. Mrs. Margaret O'Brien, a widow from the Irish section of Locust Point, had brought her teenage son Patrick to St. Jude's for treatment of a broken arm. Dr. Morse had insisted that the boy needed to stay overnight for observation, but Patrick had never come home. When Mrs. O'Brien returned to inquire about her son, she was told he had been transferred to a facility better equipped to handle his condition. Similar stories emerged from other families. Heinrich Müller, a German dock worker, had been admitted for treatment of a severe laceration on his leg. His wife received a message that he had died during routine surgery, but when she asked to see his body, she was told it had already been buried in a pauper's grave. The common thread in all these cases was Dr. Morse's insistence on treating these patients personally, often moving them to room 401 for procedures that should have been handled in the main surgical ward. Clara began to realize that her nighttime observations weren't isolated incidents, but part of a much larger and more sinister pattern. As the investigation gained momentum, strange things began happening at St. Jude's. Medical supplies started disappearing from the hospital's stores. Clara found bottles of chloroform and ether missing from the locked cabinets, along with surgical instruments that Dr. Morse claimed had been sent for sharpening, but never returned. The hospital's financial records, which Clara had access to as head nurse, showed payments to unknown suppliers and mysterious transfers of funds that didn't correspond to any official medical expenses. Dr. Morse seemed to be operating a separate enterprise within the hospital, one that generated significant income from unknown sources. The revelation came from an unexpected source. Dr. James Harrison, a young surgeon who had recently joined St. Jude's staff, approached Clara with disturbing information. He had been reviewing some of Dr. Morse's surgical notes and found references to experimental procedures that had never been approved by the hospital's board of directors. "Miss Pemberton," Dr. Harrison said quietly, "I believe Dr. Morse has been conducting unauthorized medical experiments on patients. These notes describe procedures that would never be permitted in any legitimate medical facility." The notes Dr. Harrison had found were written in a mixture of English and what appeared to be German medical terminology. They described surgical techniques that were far beyond anything being practiced in American hospitals at the time, including experimental procedures on the human nervous system and attempts to study the effects of various drugs on pain sensation. Most disturbing were the detailed observations of patient reactions to these procedures, written in Dr. Morse's precise handwriting. The note suggested that he had been deliberately causing pain to study human responses to trauma, using the poor and vulnerable patients of St. Jude's as unwilling subjects for his research. Clara realized that the sounds she had been hearing from room 401 weren't supernatural at all, but the very real screams of Dr. Morse's victims. The surgical procedures she had witnessed were actually torture sessions disguised as medical research. Dr. Harrison and Clara decided to investigate room 401 more thoroughly. They waited until Dr. Morse had left for the evening, then made their way to the 4th floor. What they found in room 401 confirmed their worst fears. The room had been modified with restraints attached to the operating table, and the walls were lined with additional surgical instruments that weren't part of the hospital's standard equipment. Hidden behind a false panel, they discovered detailed records of Dr. Morse's experiments, including sketches of surgical procedures and notes about the subject's responses to various forms of trauma. The records revealed that Dr. Morse had been selling his experimental findings to medical schools and private physicians in Philadelphia and New York, marketing his research as advanced pain management techniques developed through controlled studies. The poor patients of St. Jude's had been unknowingly funding his research with their suffering. If you're finding this story as disturbing as I am, please give this video a like to help others discover these hidden chapters of American medical history. And don't forget to subscribe. We have many more dark secrets waiting to be revealed. As Clara and Dr. Harrison delved deeper into the evidence, they realized the full scope of Dr. Morse's operation. The missing patients hadn't been transferred to other facilities. They had died during his experiments and been secretly buried in unmarked graves in Baltimore's Potter's Field. The investigation took on new urgency when Clara discovered that Dr. Morse was planning to leave Baltimore. She had overheard him making arrangements to transfer to a hospital in Chicago, where he intended to continue his research with a fresh supply of unsuspecting patients. Dr. Harrison contacted the Baltimore Police Department, but the authorities were reluctant to investigate a respected physician without overwhelming evidence. The word of a nurse and a junior doctor wasn't enough to bring charges against Dr. Morse, especially when his victims were poor immigrants who had no voice in Baltimore society. Clara made a desperate decision. She would gather definitive proof of Dr. Morse's crimes, even if it meant putting herself in danger. She began staying late at the hospital, watching and waiting for another of his nighttime procedures. Her opportunity came on November 15, 1891. Clara saw Dr. Morse's associates bringing another patient through the back entrance, a young Irish woman who appeared to be heavily sedated. Clara positioned herself in a supply closet adjacent to room 401, where she could hear and see everything that happened. What she witnessed that night would haunt her for the rest of her life. Dr. Morse and his assistants weren't just conducting medical experiments. They were deliberately torturing their victims while taking detailed notes about their responses. The sounds Clara had been hearing weren't the normal sounds of surgery, but the systematic infliction of pain for the purpose of research. The young woman's screams echoed through the hospital as Dr. Morse tested various surgical procedures without proper anesthesia, recording her reactions in his notebook. Clara watched in horror as he explained to his assistants that pain was necessary for their research, that these subjects were contributing to medical advancement in ways they could never understand. Clara had seen enough. She rushed from her hiding place and confronted Dr. Morse in the middle of his procedure. "Stop!" she screamed. "You're not a doctor. You're a monster." "Doctor." Morse's cold eyes fixed on her with deadly intent. "Miss Pemberton, you have seen something that was not meant for your eyes. I'm afraid you've become a liability to our important work." His assistants moved to restrain Clara, but she had anticipated this possibility. She had already sent a message to Dr. Harrison and the police, time to arrive if she didn't return home by midnight. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor told her that help was coming. Dr. Morse attempted to flee, but Dr. Harrison and 2 police officers burst into room 401 just as he was trying to escape through a window. The scene they found was undeniable evidence of his crimes. The modified operating table, the tortured patient, the detailed records of his experiments. The young Irish woman survived, though she would bear the physical and psychological scars of her ordeal for the rest of her life. Her testimony, combined with the evidence found in room 401, finally gave authorities what they needed to bring Dr. Morse to justice. The investigation revealed that Dr. Morse had been responsible for the deaths of at least 17 patients over the course of 2 years. He had been selling his experimental findings to medical institutions across the country, profiting from the suffering of Baltimore's most vulnerable citizens. St. Jude's Hospital was permanently closed in September 1891, its reputation too damaged to continue operations. The building was sold to a textile company, but the new owners found that no one wanted to work in a place where such horrors had occurred. Dr. Sebastian Morse was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, though he died in prison before his execution could be carried out. His body was buried in an unmarked grave, and his name was struck from the medical registries of 3 states. Clara Pemberton refused to leave the hospital building, even after its closure. She had accepted a caretaker position, unable to abandon the place where she had witnessed so much suffering. She felt responsible for the patients she hadn't been able to save, and she couldn't bear the thought of their memories being forgotten. For 3 months after the hospital's closure, Clara lived alone in the building, maintaining the empty rooms and keeping vigil over the place where so many had died. But the sounds from room 401 continued to haunt her nights, not supernatural manifestations, but the very real echoes of trauma that seemed to have soaked into the walls themselves. The explanation for the sounds Clara continued to hear was discovered quite by accident. During a routine inspection of the building's ventilation system, workmen found that the air shafts connecting the basement to the 4th floor had been modified to carry sound with unusual clarity. The grinding and mechanical noises Clara heard were actually coming from the basement, where Dr. Morse had hidden additional evidence of his crimes. In the basement, investigators found a workshop where Dr. Morse had been constructing specialized surgical instruments for his experiments. The grinding sounds were created by a ventilation system that had been damaged during the hospital's closure, causing metal components to rub against each other and create the eerie noises that had tormented Clara's nights. Just when we think we've seen it all, the horror in Baltimore's medical history intensifies. If this story is giving you the creeps, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Give it a like to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Let's find out together what happens next in America's hidden past. The final chapter of Clara's story came in December 1891. After learning the truth about the sounds that had haunted her, she finally felt at peace with leaving St. Jude's Hospital. She had done everything she could to honor the memory of Dr. Morse's victims and ensure that their suffering would not be forgotten. Clara moved to a small apartment in Baltimore's Canton neighborhood, where she worked as a private nurse until her retirement. She never married, dedicating her life to caring for others and speaking out about the need for oversight in medical practice. Her testimony was instrumental in establishing new regulations for hospital operations in Maryland. The building that once housed St. Jude's Hospital was eventually demolished in 1923, but the site remained vacant for decades. Local residents reported that the sounds of medical procedures could still be heard on certain nights, carried by the wind from the empty lot where the hospital had stood. This mystery shows us that the most terrifying monsters are often those who hide behind respected professions and use their authority to exploit the vulnerable. Dr. Morse's crimes were made possible by a system that valued the word of a physician over the lives of the poor and immigrant communities he preyed upon. What do you think about this story? Do you believe Clara's dedication to exposing the truth was worth the personal cost she paid? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story and want more horror stories from America's dark past, subscribe, activate the bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video, where we'll uncover another buried secret that the authorities wanted to keep hidden forever.